Welcome back to my channel. Dylan stepped out into the dimming Los Angeles evening, thinking she would find a moment of peace after a long and emotionally exhausting day. She instead found Luna waiting in the shadows, her expression unreadable but her presence unmistakably intense, and before Dylan could even gather her thoughts or ask the questions already racing through her mind, Luna stepped forward with a quiet urgency that immediately set the tone for everything that followed, telling Dylan in a low, controlled voice that there were two things she needed her to do, two things that could not wait, two things that would change everything. And though Dylan's instincts screamed that this was dangerous, that nothing good ever came from Luna's sudden demands, she also knew there was no walking away from this moment, not when Luna's eyes held that desperate, almost haunted look, the kind that suggested secrets too heavy to carry alone. And so Dylan hesitated only briefly before asking what Luna wanted, her voice steady but her heart pounding, and Luna wasted no time in answering, first demanding that Dylan come with her immediately to a secluded location, refusing to explain further but insisting that what she needed to show her could not be discussed in public or over the phone, and second, more shockingly, ordering Dylan to lie to everyone, especially to the people who cared about her most, about where she was going and why. A demand that hit Dylan like a slap because it went against everything she believed in, everything she had fought to maintain in a life already tangled with secrets and betrayals, and yet Luna stood firm, her gaze unwavering as she told Dylan that if she refused, the consequences would be far worse than a simple lie, that there were truths on the verge of coming out that could destroy lives, including Dylan's own, and that this was the only way to control the fallout. And as the weight of Luna's words sank in, Dylan felt the ground shift beneath her. The sense of control she had been clinging to slipping away as she realized that whatever Luna was involved in had escalated beyond anything she had imagined, and despite her fear and her doubts, she found herself agreeing, if only because she needed answers and because something deep inside her told her that Luna wasn't bluffing, that whatever this was, it was real and it was urgent. And so Dylan made the first of the two choices Luna demanded, pulling out her phone and sending a carefully worded message to assure everyone that she was fine and simply needed some time alone, the lie tasting bitter even as she typed it, and then with a deep breath, she followed Luna into the unknown, the two of them slipping away into the night as the lights of the city blurred around them, and the drive that followed was suffocatingly silent, filled with tension and unspoken questions, until they finally arrived at a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of the city, a place that seemed deliberately chosen for its anonymity. And as Luna led Dylan inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately, the air thick with anticipation and something else, fear perhaps or regret, and Dylan's heart raced as she demanded to know what was going on, what could possibly justify the secrecy and the lies, and for a moment Luna said nothing, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the emotional turmoil beneath, before she finally turned to Dylan and began to explain, revealing a truth so shocking, so deeply intertwined with their past and their future, that Dylan struggled to process it, a truth involving hidden connections, long-buried secrets, and a revelation about a child that changed everything they thought they knew. And as Luna spoke, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain strong, it became clear that she wasn't just making demands for the sake of control, she was desperate, cornered by circumstances that had spiraled beyond her control, and the two things she had forced Dylan to do were, in her mind, the only way to buy time to protect what little she still could. And Dylan, caught between anger and empathy, found herself grappling with the realization that Luna's actions, however manipulative they seemed, were driven by something deeper, something that might even justify the risk she was taking. And yet the second demand, the lie, continued to weigh heavily on her, a constant reminder that she was now complicit in whatever Luna was hiding. And as the night unfolded, the tension between them grew, each new piece of information adding another layer to the already complex situation, until Dylan finally reached a breaking point, her voice rising as she confronted Luna about the consequences of her actions, about the people who would be hurt when the truth inevitably came out, and Luna, in turn, fired back with a raw honesty that stripped away any remaining illusions, admitting that she knew the damage she was causing, that she hated herself for it, but that she saw no other way. And in that moment the dynamic between them shifted again, the power struggle giving way to a fragile understanding, a recognition that they were both trapped in a situation neither of them had fully chosen. And as the hours passed, the urgency that had driven Luna's initial demands began to make more sense, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place, revealing a picture far more complicated and far more dangerous than Dylan had ever anticipated. And yet even as clarity began to emerge, so did new questions, new uncertainties that threatened to unravel everything all over again. And Dylan realized that agreeing to Luna's two demands was only the beginning, that she had stepped into something that would require even more difficult choices in the days to come, choices that would test her loyalty, her integrity, and her strength in ways she had never experienced before. And as the first light of dawn crept through the windows of the secluded house, casting a pale glow over the two women who now shared a secret that could change everything, Dylan couldn't help but wonder whether she had made the right decision, whether helping Luna in this moment would ultimately fully being on anyone's side, and Brooke admitting that she felt like she was constantly fighting to protect her children in a world that seemed determined to knock them down. And for a brief moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them, a reminder of the sisterhood that had survived so much over the years, but it was fragile, overshadowed by the hurt that still lingered, especially after the slap, which neither of them could ignore. And Katie finally said that what Brooke had done crossed a line, that no matter how angry or upset she was, that kind of reaction wasn't acceptable. And Brooke, her voice softer now, acknowledged that she had gone too far, that she shouldn't have let her emotions take over like that. But the apology felt incomplete, weighed down by everything that had led up to it, and Katie accepted it with a nod but made it clear that it didn't erase what had happened, that trust had been shaken, that something between them had shifted. And as the conversation wound down, the energy in the room changed from explosive to heavy, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when the damage is still being assessed. And Brooke, though still hurting, began to realize that directing all her anger at Katie wasn't going to fix anything, wasn't going to bring hope back to Forrester Creations, wasn't going to undo the pain her daughter was feeling. And Katie, though still stung both physically and emotionally, understood that Brooke's reaction came from a place of deep love and fear, even if it had been expressed in the worst possible way. And they stood there for a moment, not quite reconciled but not completely broken either, caught in that complicated space where family relationships often exist, where love and anger intertwine, where forgiveness is possible but not immediate. And as Brooke finally turned to leave, her mind already racing with thoughts of how to help hope move forward, how to rebuild what had been lost, Katie remained behind, touching her cheek lightly, reflecting on everything that had just happened, knowing that this moment would have lasting consequences not just for their relationship, but for the entire family dynamic, because in the world they lived in, where business and personal lives were so deeply intertwined, conflicts like this never stayed contained, they rippled outward, affecting everyone, and the fallout from this confrontation was only just beginning. Brooke Logan stood frozen in the middle of the Forrester Creations executive office, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion, the weight of everything that had just happened crashing down on her all at once. And across from her, Katie Logan looked equally shaken but far less apologetic, her posture stiff, her chin lifted in quiet defiance as the silence between them stretched unbearably thin, until Brooke finally broke it, her voice trembling but sharp as she demanded to know how Katie could have let things go this far, how she could have stood by while Hope lost everything she had worked for, everything she had poured her heart into. And Katie, clearly exhausted from the ongoing tension, tried to explain that it wasn't that simple, that decisions at Forrester Creations were complicated, layered with business pressures and family loyalties. But Brooke wasn't hearing it, not really, because all she could see was her daughter's pain, Hope's devastated face when she was told she was no longer part of the company, the disbelief, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal. And in Brooke's mind, Katie had been in a position to stop it, to intervene, to do something, anything, and she hadn't, and that failure burned like a personal betrayal, igniting something fierce and uncontrollable inside Brooke that she could no longer hold back. And as Katie tried again to reason with her, to remind her that Hope's line had been struggling, that there had been complaints, that the board had made a collective decision, Brooke stepped closer, her eyes flashing with anger and hurt, accusing Katie of hiding behind excuses, of choosing neutrality when her own family needed her, of letting corporate politics outweigh blood. And Katie's expression hardened as she fired. That said everything without a word, and in that instant, the abstract threat Luna had described became terrifyingly real, because if someone had followed them, if someone had already begun to suspect, then the time they thought they had just bought might already be slipping away. And Luna moved quickly, her earlier hesitation replaced by sharp, decisive action as she motioned for Dylan to stay quiet and edged toward the window. carefully peering out into the early morning light. And Dylan's heart pounded in her chest as she held her breath, every instinct telling her that this was the moment where everything could unravel. And although Luna eventually stepped back and assured her that it was nothing, just a passing car, a coincidence, the tension didn't fully dissipate, because the possibility of being discovered was now no longer theoretical, it was immediate, and that realization hardened something in both of them, a shared understanding that they couldn't afford to hesitate or second-guess themselves anymore. And as they sat back down, the conversation shifted again, becoming more focused, more strategic, as they began to outline their next steps, discussing who needed to be protected, who might already be suspicious, and how they could navigate the delicate balance between secrecy and preparation. And Dylan found herself stepping into that mindset more naturally than she expected, contributing ideas, asking questions, and even challenging Luna when something didn't feel right. And in doing so, she began to reclaim a sense of agency that had been slipping away since the moment Luna confronted her. But even as she did, a part of her couldn't help but wonder what the cost of this would be, what it would do to her relationships when the truth finally came out, because no matter how carefully they handled it, there would be consequences, there would be hurt, and there would be fallout that couldn't be undone. And as the sun rose higher, casting stronger light into the room and signaling the start of a new day, Dylan realized that there was no turning back from this, that the two things Luna had forced her to do, go with her and lie, had set her on a path that would change everything, and whether that change would ultimately lead to resolution or destruction was still unclear. But one thing was certain. The truth was coming, and when it did, it would hit harder than anyone was prepared for, and the only question that remained was whether they could shape it enough to survive the impact or whether it would tear everything apart before they had the chance. The hours that followed felt stretched thin between urgency and dread, and as the reality of what they had set in motion settled deeper into Dylan's bones, she found herself increasingly aware that time, something she had always taken for granted, had now become their most dangerous enemy, because every passing minute was another opportunity for the truth to surface without their control. Another chance for someone at Forrester Creations to notice her absence, to question the carefully crafted lie she had sent, or worse, to start connecting the same dots Luna feared were already being traced by an unseen threat. And Luna, pacing the length of the small living room with restless intensity, seemed to feel that pressure even more acutely, her mind racing through contingencies and worst-case scenarios as she began outlining the next phase of what she now called containment. A word that immediately unsettled Dylan because it implied something volatile, something already leaking beyond their grasp, and when Dylan pressed her on it, Luna admitted that the situation wasn't just about hiding a truth anymore. It was about preventing a chain reaction that could implicate multiple people, including individuals who had no idea they were even connected to the secret. And that was when Dylan's thoughts turned sharply toward the people she cared about most, imagining the shock on their faces if everything came crashing out at once, imagining the betrayal they would feel when they learned she had known something and chosen not to tell them, even if only temporarily. And the guilt of that possibility hit her like a wave, forcing her to sit down as she tried to steady herself. But Luna didn't give her long to process, because she quickly shifted the conversation to something even more immediate, telling Dylan that the second part of her demand, the lie, needed to evolve, that a single message wouldn't be enough to hold off suspicion for long, especially from those who knew Dylan well, and that they needed to build a consistent narrative, something believable enough to withstand questions if and when they came. And Dylan, though reluctant, understood the logic, even as it pushed her further into a role she never wanted to play. And so the two of them began crafting that narrative together, carefully choosing details that felt natural, deciding how long Dylan would be away, and even discussing how she would behave when she returned so that nothing seemed out of place. And the level of calculation involved made Dylan uneasy, because it reminded her of just how far from normal this situation had become, how deeply she had already crossed into territory she once judged others for inhabiting, and yet there was no denying that it was necessary, at least for now. And as they worked through those details, Luna suddenly paused, her expression tightening, as if a new realization had just struck her, and she turned to Dylan with a question that shifted the entire tone of the conversation once. Brooke, her voice softer now, acknowledged that she had gone too far, that she shouldn't have let her emotions take over like that, but the apology felt incomplete, weighed down by everything that had led up to it, and Katie accepted it with a nod but made it clear that it didn't erase what had happened, that trust had been shaken, that something between them had shifted. And as the conversation wound down, The energy in the room changed from explosive to heavy, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when the damage is still being assessed, and Brooke, though still hurting, began to realize that directing all her anger at Katie wasn't going to fix anything, wasn't going to bring hope back to Forrester Creations, wasn't going to undo the pain her daughter was feeling, and Katie, though still stung both physically and emotionally, understood that Brooke's reaction came from a place of deep love and fear, even if it had been expressed in the worst possible way, and they stood there for a moment, not quite reconciled but not completely broken either, caught in that complicated space where family relationships often exist, where love and anger intertwine, where forgiveness is possible but not immediate, and as Brooke finally turned to leave, her mind already racing with thoughts of how to help Hope move forward, how to rebuild what had been lost, Katie remained behind, touching her cheek lightly, reflecting on everything that had just happened, knowing that this moment would have lasting consequences not just for their relationship, but for the entire family dynamic, because in the world they lived in, where business and personal lives were so deeply intertwined, conflicts like this never stayed contained, they rippled outward, affecting everyone, and the fallout from this confrontation was only just beginning. Brooke Logan didn't make it far down the hallway of Forrester Creations before the weight of what had just happened caught up with her steps slowing as the echo of that slap replayed over and over in her mind, each repetition tightening the knot of guilt forming in her chest. Yet even as regret began to creep in, it wrestled stubbornly with the fierce, protective anger she still felt for her daughter, because in Brooke's heart, Hope Logan's firing wasn't just a business decision, it was a betrayal, a dismissal of everything Hope had stood for, everything she had tried to build under the Forrester banner, and that sense of injustice refused to let Brooke fully soften. Even now, while back in the office Katie Logan remained rooted in place, the initial shock giving way to a slow burn of her own, her fingers brushing lightly against her cheek not because of the pain but because of what it represented, a line crossed, a fracture in a relationship that had survived decades of turmoil, and as Katie exhaled, she whispered to herself that this couldn't be how things were going to continue, that something had to change, because if Brooke was willing to lash out like that, then the situation with Hope was even more volatile than she had feared, and across the building, word was already beginning to spread, because nothing stayed quiet for long within Forrester Creations, especially not something as explosive as a physical altercation between two Logans, and whispers started to circulate among staff, assistants exchanging concerned glances, executives closing doors a little more tightly as they discussed the implications, because if the Logan sisters were turning on each other, it signaled a deeper instability within the company's already fragile internal dynamics, and it wasn't long before Hope herself caught wind of it, the news reaching her not through gossip but through a concerned call from someone who had witnessed the aftermath. And when Hope heard that her mother had slapped Katie in her defense, her immediate reaction wasn't gratitude or validation, but a sinking sense of dread, because the last thing she wanted was for her situation to tear her family apart. And as she hung up the phone, she sat in silence, processing the ripple effect of her firing, realizing that the consequences were extending far beyond her own career, touching the very core of her family relationships, and that realization brought tears to her eyes because despite everything, despite how hurt and humiliated she felt by losing her position, she never wanted to be the cause of this kind of division. And meanwhile Brooke found herself outside, the fresh air doing little to calm the storm inside her as she replayed not just the slap but everything leading up to it. Every word, every accusation, every look on Katie's face, and she knew deep down that she had let her emotions take control in a way that wasn't fair, that wasn't right, but at the same time she couldn't shake the feeling that Katie had failed them, that she had stood by when she should have fought, and that conflict between guilt and conviction kept Brooke suspended in a state of emotional unrest, unsure of what to do next, whether to go back and try to repair things with Katie or to focus entirely on helping Hope navigate this crisis.